Hello, today we are hosting an interview with CJ Watson, the author of Before I Go to Sleep, Second Life and the Final Cut. They were translated in Romanian by Trei publishing house. And my first question will be, from what started the story in Before I Go to Sleep, and how long did it take you to write it?
Before I Go to Sleep, the idea came from an obituary that I read. So it was about a guy who had died in America, and the obituary described that he had been he was 86 when he died, but for most of his life he'd been known as Patient HM. His real name was Henry Malazon, but he'd been known as Patient HM. And the reason for that was he was, during his teenage years and into his early adulthood, he had been diagnosed with very, very severe epilepsy. So he was having very frequent fits, and they were very, very severe fits, which meant that he couldn't live any kind of sort of normal life. He couldn't hold down a job. He couldn't have friendships even, and it was becoming obviously very debilitating and very incapacitating. So in a kind of he'd tried lots of medication and things, and in a last ditch attempt to help him, he'd undergone an experimental surgical procedure. So he'd had an operation in which they'd removed part of his brain. And they'd removed the part of his brain, obviously, which they felt was responsible for the epilepsy. But what they hadn't realized was that that was also responsible for storing long-term memory. And so the obituary described how when he woke up, basically, he was unable to, he'd lost most of the memories he'd had until that point in his life. And he also couldn't form new memories. So I later did some research and learned that his memory was, he could remember things for a few minutes and then things would disappear. And so I read this obituary, and I was just really struck by, first of all, the thing that struck me the most was that he was, I think something like, he was in his 20s anyway when he had this operation, and he died at the age of 86. And so I just thought that he must have woken up, if he didn't form any new memories in that whole time, he must have woken up sort of towards the end of his life. And expected to see a 20-something-year-old person looking back at him in the mirror, and instead he must have obviously seen an older man. And so that really made me think a lot about, first of all, how terrifying that must have been, but also how important memory is to us in terms of our understanding of who we are, and how we came to be in the situation we're in, and our life history. I suppose we've all kind of got we've all got some understanding of our own autobiography, I suppose. The good bits, the bad bits, the choices that we've made, the things that have happened to us, and to lose all of that, I just thought it must have been so terrifying. And so when I read this obituary, I had this mental image of a woman looking in a mirror, expecting to see a sort of teenager or a young woman looking back, and instead seeing someone in their 40s. And so that became the basis of the book, really. That was the first scene, the scene that opened the book. And although it wasn't the first scene I wrote, but in terms of how long it took me to write it, I think I sort of probably read that obituary in maybe January of the year 2009, it would have been. And I started writing the book in maybe February, I think. And I finished the first draft in August. So it's quite quick. Although it was then probably another, I would say maybe another 7 months, actually a little bit longer, yeah, maybe 8 or 9 months until the book was finally done. So I had to do quite a lot of work in the redraft because it's quite a complex book. So, but anyway, all in all, it probably took me about 14 months to write it, which I've now, because of the 2-3 books really I've written subsequent to that, I've realized that's very quick for me.
Why do you think your debut novel gathered so much attention and had so much success? Is it because it is an innovative story, because it is a good, thrilling story, or was it publicity as well?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I think when I wrote it, I wasn't really thinking about the genre I was writing in. So I didn't really write it to be a psychological thriller. particularly then, I didn't really pay that much attention to genre when I read. So and I do still read very widely. I don't read within a particular genre, but when I came to write before I go to sleep, the idea came to me, the characters came to me, and to a lesser extent, the twist or the truth at the heart of the book came to me. But I wasn't writing it thinking, hey, this is how you make a psychological thriller. This is how you construct a psychological thriller. And so I think for that reason, I came at it from a slightly different angle than most crime novels did at that time. I'm not saying I invented anything new, but I think it doesn't start with a body at the beginning. It's not a whodunit. It doesn't follow a lot of the usual, it doesn't hit a lot of the beats that especially then, a lot of psychological thrillers would have hit. So I think it was slightly unusual in that sense. I think it had a bit of a universal theme in a way. I think a lot of people maybe read it and hadn't really thought about memory in quite that way. And I think because it was written in the first person, especially, I think it kind of connected with people in a way, if that makes sense. I think people read the book and thought a little bit differently about themselves or their memory, or at least how important memory is to them, I think. And also I think because it had that kind of concept, that high concept. I don't really like the phrase high concept, but people use it, so we'll go with it. I think it was one of those things that, you know, you could walk into a bookstore and you could say, I really want that book. I don't remember who it's by or what it's called, but it's the one about memory. And people, once it got, you know, once there was a certain amount of press and everything behind it, people understood which book that was. And I mean, I don't know what the jacket was like in Romania, but in the UK there was the eye on the cover, which was also quite unusual. And so I think people also were like, you know, it's that book that's got the eye. So that helped too. So I think it was a lot of things that came together, one of which was publicity. But actually there wasn't that much. I mean, it sounds strange, but there wasn't that much marketing. There weren't big posters. A lot of it was word of mouth. There seemed to be quite a buzz about the book from quite early on, before it was even published. So I think it was a combination of all those things, but I'd like to think obviously it was because it was, at the end of the day, it was a good book that people enjoyed reading and that they wanted to recommend to their friends. You know, I think a lot of it was word of mouth. I think it was people in book clubs and amongst their friends saying, I've read this book, it's great, you should read it. So yeah, I hope that was it.
I think I bought your book back in the day in 2011, I think, in England, from a car boot. Do you know the boot fairs?
Yeah.
Yes, and it gathered my attention with that special cover.
Yeah, I think it was quite a
before
striking
it was
cover.
even published in Romania, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a striking cover. It wasn't the first book to have had an eye on the cover in that way, but I think it did it in a particular way. And I think people, you know, you couldn't really miss it. And also, I think a bit like the book, it spoke a little bit towards the genre of psychological thriller, but it wasn't kind of highlighting this is a psychological thriller or this is a crime novel or is this. People read it. I think people picked up not quite sure what to expect, which I think probably helped.
I think the initials as well helped a little bit.
Yeah.
SJ instead of a full name.
Yeah, again,
the next question.
That was partly, well, it was because I when I sent the book out, I was very aware that I was a man writing from a woman's point of view, using the first person. And so I thought, if I've got this wrong, the whole book falls down. You know, if people read it and go, well, this is clearly a bloke, because women don't think like that. You know, I thought the whole book doesn't work. And so when we sent the book out to publishers, we decided to use my agent. This is my agent and I. We decided to use my initials to see whether anybody would go, whether anybody would see through it. And it wasn't a kind of deliberate attempt to fool anybody or hide anything, but it was very gratifying to me when some people came back to my agent and was like, oh, what's she like, and has she written anything before, and how did you meet her? And that was very reassuring to me, that people read the book and didn't immediately assume that I was a man.
The next question is it's a little bit longer.
Okay.
But I hope you can answer to it. My personal opinion is that before I go to sleep, finish the Da Vinci Code era and represented the start for the new thriller era, like Gone Girl, The Girl in the Train, or the most recent stories like The Silent Patient, The Behind Her Eyes, or The Woman in the Window. Dark and complex characters with a lot of secrets, with twisted ends, which changes everything you knew until then and makes you reconsider all the informations and ideas you thought you found. Am I wrong about that? What do you think about this idea?
I don't know that I would say you were wrong. No, I mean it wasn't something I sat down and decided to do. But I think looking back, I mean it's now 10 years ago, and I think looking back, it is true to say that it did kind of usher in a new era of what could be called domestic thrillers. So, you know, thrillers that would tended to be set within the home, with a slightly more female focus than had been the case. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's, and I'm incredibly flattered that you know, not that I have anything against this sort of Da Vinci Code, sort of those kind of books, you know, the girl with the dragon tattoo and all those sort of things. But I think they occupy a slightly different zone, maybe, you know, of like not being in the domestic sphere, I suppose, for want of a better way of putting it. And I think people I think like those books, like the ones you mentioned, Gone Girl, Girl on the Train. Obviously, they did incredibly well, and were turned into great films. But I think it's because there's something quite identifiable about them, I suppose. I think you can maybe a lot of readers and viewers can identify with those characters in a way that perhaps they don't identify in quite the same way with the characters in something like you know, Da Vinci Code and stuff. So yeah, I think it's a fair point. I'm not going to argue it. I'm quite pleased.
At least, did you start with this intention to change the genre or make something new? Come with something new?
No, I mean, I don't think you can necessarily sit down and with that intention. And it was my debut as well, so I just wanted to write a book. My big dream for the book was that it would be published, and I didn't. And that was obviously not a definite. It was far from definite. There are lots of really great books that are written and are never published, and there are lots of really great, you know, terrible books that are written that are published. But you know, it wasn't. That was my big dream. It wasn't to change anything. It wasn't to kind of, you know, usher in a new era of crime writing. It was just to write a really good story. But I think partly because I don't know. I think I am sort of driven to try and do something different. I think. I think the reason that when I read that obituary that I mentioned at the beginning, and when I heard about Henry Malaysia's story, the reason I think it spoke to me, well, there are several reasons it spoke to me, but one of them I think was because I saw this as an opportunity to write a book about someone who doesn't have memory, but from their point of view. You know, so being inside that character, writing it in the first person, and I don't think I'd ever come across that before in quite the same way. So I think I did see it as, oh, this is something that hasn't been done before, or certainly hadn't been done to my knowledge anyway. So I was trying to do something new, perhaps, or something slightly different. But I think partly, as I said, because I didn't come to the genre from a point of view as someone who's been immersed in it for years and read, you know, every single psychological thriller that had been written for the last 25 years, because I hadn't done that. I think I brought to it some different elements that perhaps did make it slightly different and slightly new. So yeah, it wasn't a deliberate thing, but it was. I suppose there was a deliberateness in as much as I wanted to write a book I hadn't read before. So yeah, I wanted to do something different.
And you've done it.
Thank you.
After Before I Go to Sleep came Second Life. What inspired you to write about Julia's and her sister stories? Also, which was the source for your latest novel, Final Cut?
Yeah, Second Life came together in a slightly more gradual way. I wanted to write about. I suppose I wanted to write about again, I'm quite obsessed with identity. I think all of my books have something in them about identity and about us, our own understanding of who we are. And I think I was very struck by the way that can change depending on what situation we're in. I think it's not a coincidence that that Second Life happened. That book came to me before I go to sleep. But by that I mean after the success of Before I Go to Sleep, because I think the success of my first book, which is very quick and very unexpected, it meant I had to, or I found myself almost splitting my personality, if that makes sense. Not in a, obviously not in a literal way, but I found that there was a part of me that was Steve at home, that was, making my dinner and watching the telly and washing up and all that normal, and seeing my friends and all that kind of normal stuff. But then there was S.J. Watson, who was doing stuff like this and appearing on book, at book festivals when they were a thing that we were allowed to go to, but and doing interviews with journalists and talking about myself. And I'm naturally, especially then, I mean, less so now, about 10 years of it, but especially then, I found it very uncomfortable. I'm quite a shy person, as I think many writers are. And so I found that I was almost starting to think of S.J. Watson as a separate person to Steve. And I think partly because of that, I was just interested in how actually that's not unique to somebody who's written a novel or, had success to that extent. I think we all do it to a lesser extent. We're all slightly different people depending on the situation that we're in, and we might be slightly different people when we're at work, different again at home, different again when we're with our parents, perhaps different, again when we're with our, wherever we are, we emphasize perhaps a slightly different part of our personality. And so I'd become quite interested in, when are we real? When are we actually us in the truest sense? I don't have the answer. Someone pointed out that all my books have bathrooms in. People go into the bathroom and they lock the door and they look in the mirror. Not sure if they do in Final Cut. Maybe she does. Can't quite remember. But anyway, I think that's because I think subconsciously, perhaps, I do wonder whether that's when we're most ourselves, when we're inside the bathroom, because it's the only, generally speaking, it's the only room in the house that has a lock on the door. We can go in and we can lock the door and we can lock ourselves in and be alone. And there's also a mirror, a reflective surface that literally shows us ourselves. So yeah, so I was interested in that with Second Life, and how the internet allows you to be much more deliberate, I suppose, in pretending to be somebody you're not, or emphasizing or de-emphasizing bits of yourself you don't like and emphasizing bits of yourself that you do like. So I was interested in that. And then I became fascinated by addiction. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who has lost lots of people to various addictions. And she said to me, well, addiction is a very patient disease. And that really struck me. And I was really fascinated by addiction then, and sort of the way that people who have suffered with an addiction can believe that they've overcome it, and that they're, because they're no longer drinking, or because they're no longer taking drugs, or whatever it was that they were, using to as the crutch or as the support. But often addiction will just come around, and it'll sort of come and manifest itself in a different way. So, I know people that have given up drink, for example, but then they then become addicted to work, or they've become addicted to TV, whatever it might be. There's a different. So I was kind of fascinated by that, and I saw addiction as almost another character in Second Life, as the real antagonist of that book is the character's addiction, and how the internet allows that addiction to manifest itself in a way that she wasn't expecting. So that's where Second Life came from, really. And then with Final Cut, I've always loved documentaries and filmmaking, and I became really fascinated with the way that nowadays everybody, well, not everybody, but most, even my parents, everyone I know, I think, walks around with a mobile phone in their pocket, which has a camera and a video camera on it, and people are documenting their lives and sharing their lives in a way that is really quite new. I mean, you've only got to go back, certainly if you go back 20 years, it wasn't happening, possibly even 10 years. I don't think Instagram and stuff was a thing 10 years ago even. Certainly not in quite the same way it was now. But anyway, so I became fascinated in the way that documentary filmmaking is a kind of, it's something that we all can do. And again, it's about curating our life. It's about creating this sense of self, if you like. So yeah, I wanted to write a book. There were also two particular documentaries that interested me, and one of which was called Life in a Day, which was, I think it's around 2014. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago anyway. And I don't know if you know that film, but it was compiled by, on a particular day of the year, the filmmakers had invited anyone around the world, and said, upload a film of your life on this day. And then they kind of sifted through hours and hours and hours of footage and created this 2-hour film of the story of planet Earth on one particular day in July in 2013 or whenever it was. And that really fascinated me, this way that somebody could put a film together about life, actually recorded not by a professional cameraman or camerawoman, but actually made by the people in the film. And so that's where that book kind of evolved. And in a way, it's kind of almost a flip. I didn't really realize this at the time when I was writing it, but afterwards I kind of realized it's almost the flip side of Second Life, where in terms of where Second Life allows somebody knowingly to create, it's about the way that the internet rather allows somebody very knowingly to create another sense of themselves, a false version of themselves, I suppose, and put that out there on the internet. In Final Cut, it's about the way that the internet and social media actually means that an attempt to hide yourself it makes it harder to hide who you really are. I mean, Final Cut is a book about character. In a way, one of the elements anyway it's about characters who are trying to keep something hidden and finding it impossible to do that because of the way that everything is shared on the internet and on social media, and everything is available. So that's where that book came from. It's kind of my love of documentaries combined with a fascination with the way that people document themselves and document their lives.
I got the impression after started reading your third novel that unlike your first two novels, you now chose to approach a classic theme, like the guy or the girl who comes back in his or her hometown village to solve a new problem, only to find out that this is not new at all, and that his old traumas and secrets come back to haunt him and the new generation of people. And of course, the evil never stopped acting, of course. What made you choose this change of subject?
With Final Cut, I did want to broaden my horizons, or spread my writing wings, perhaps is a better way of putting it. In as much as Before I Go to Sleep and Second Life had both been very urban. They'd both been set in cities with all of the noise and the grime and the people living on top of each other and so on. And I did want to introduce an element of landscape into the work. I've always loved books that in which the setting is very important. So I wanted to write a book in which the setting, the places, the house in particular, became quite kind of an important part of the book. Almost felt like another character. So that was one element that is kind of quite almost like a practical. Let's do something slightly different. But then I was also just like you say, really. I think one of my other abiding, as well as being fascinated with identity, I love psychology. I've always loved psychology. I've always wanted to understand what makes people tick, and in particular, what the sort of the methods or the defense mechanisms, I suppose, that we have when we undergo trauma. And so I wanted to, with this book, take a character who had really actually quite successfully, although on a subconscious level, had quite successfully built a defense mechanism and had dealt with her trauma. It was buried. I mean, so you could argue it's not dealt with, it's buried, but it wasn't affecting her in a day-to-day way. And I wanted to see what would happen if I took a character who had done that and basically confronted her with her trauma again.
At some point that I don't remember, it never happened.
Yeah.
The character, Alex.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one that's one. I mean, one of the things that I'm really fascinated by about the notion of our own truth. I think most people have experienced this, in which you have a very different memory of a particular event than somebody else who was involved. You know, often it's within the family, but you know, you could be arguing with your brother or something about, oh, that time when you stabbed me in the arm when I was 4 and you were 6. You know, and the two people can have an incredibly different memory of what actually happened and whose fault it was, and what the situation was. And what really fascinates me in that situation is there's person A's version of the truth, there's person B's version of the truth, there's the actual truth, which is probably something slightly between the two, you know. But none of those things really matter, because person A is affected by their own memory and person B is affected by their own memory. And so we all carry our own versions of what really happened with us. And that really fascinates me. You know, it almost doesn't matter what really happened, what the objective truth was, if that even exists, because we're affected long term by what we believe happened and what we believe the truth was. So I think is very powerful and quite scary.
Why all your 3 novels until now are about women with dark and twisted pasts?
I don't know. Well, I think I continually, well, first of all, I don't really consider, I'm not somebody who thinks that men and women are sort of poles apart. And I know some people have been really shocked that as a man, I've chosen to write from a woman's point of view 3 times now. I don't really see that as being such a massive difference. For me, the challenge with Before I Go to Sleep was writing about a woman who had no memory, and it was the having no memory thing that was the struggle. It wasn't the fact that she happened to be female, and so on. And similar with all the other books. So I don't really feel like I'm writing about. I think sometimes people treat it as if I'm writing about a different species or whatever. You know, it's not, to me, it's not that different. Men and women aren't that different. There's a huge overlap, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. And a lot of the way we experience, especially experience trauma, I can't imagine is that different. You know, if the traumatic thing happens, I don't think it really makes that much difference to the body's response or to the psyche's response, whether you're male or female. Having said that, I think I have always been and still am very interested in the particular challenges that women face. And even actually, I was going to say even in the year since I've written Second Life, but even in the year that Final Cut's been out, I mean, you know, we're reminded again and again and again of the things that women have to put up with, or are asked to put up with in life that men aren't. I mean, and I suppose a very, well, I almost said trivial example. It's not trivial. It's far from trivial, but a very common example is that, you know, if you're out late at night, my male friends don't have to worry about how to get home in the same way that my female friends do, you know, in a very, very basic, just being able to be out at night after dark, or not even after dark necessarily, but just being out alone. I find that sort of, there's so much to think about there, and sort of in the way that men and women's lives are shaped by their sex, their gender, and whatever. So it's a story that I continually come back to. I'm continually fascinated by the challenges that women are faced, and I want to understand them. Maybe I want to imagine myself into their shoes and write about those particular difficulties. I mean, I used to joke that if I'd written Before I Go to Sleep from a male point of view, the guy would have just put the TV on and watched it and just thought, oh, this is fine. I mean, that's obviously a joke. It's not true. It's not what I really believe. But I do think all of the books could have been narrated by men. There's nothing particularly inherently female in any of them, I don't think. But they would have just been different books. There would have been different stories. They would have had the characters would have had different challenges and different ways of dealing with the challenges and being treated differently. So I think it's just I'm just constantly being fascinated by women's place in the world, because I think it's quite unusual I think it's quite an interesting time, because in some ways women have now got equality, but in other ways they clearly don't, because, you know, they don't have equal pay. They can't walk the streets at night knowing that they're going to be completely safe. Or rather that any source of not being safe is not going to come from their sex. Anyway, it's a very long-winded answer to your question. I think what I'm basically saying is it just fascinates me still. I wish it didn't. I wish women didn't have any particular issues that men don't have, but we're not there. So,
in the end, I have two more questions. How did the movie project started, and how do you think some of the most important movie stars ended being involved in this project? And also, may I ask your opinion about the movie?
Yeah, I love the movie. I think it's great. I wasn't particularly heavily involved, which means I wasn't involved at all, really, which means that I can say that with no sense of like ego or anything like that. I think it's a really great. I think Rowan, the director and writer, and Liza, who was the producer, I think they did a really good job of making a sort of almost an old-fashioned 90-minute Hitchcock-ish thriller, you know, that isn't all computer, you know, CGI and wizards and flying spaceships. Not that there's anything wrong with those. I love those films as well, but I think it was a really nice film. So I really love it. And how it happened, it was a bit mysterious. Whilst the book was still being sent out to publishers for consideration for publication, I got an email from someone at Scott Free, who is the Ridley Scott's production company, saying that they'd read the book and they thought it would make a really good film. And coincidentally, Ridley Scott was in town in London. Ridley Scott was in London, and where I was also based then, and he'd love to meet me for lunch or something. And I remember really clearly thinking it was one of my friends who was trying to wind me up. And trying to play a joke on me, but no, it was true. Somehow, I mean, I have my suspicions, but somehow Liza, the producer, had got her hands on the manuscript and read the book, and she'd handed it to Rowan. Rowan had connected with it straight away. I think partly because his mother is an actor, and she had also suffered, I think, a head injury, or no, I don't think it was a head injury. I think she had an illness, but she did have some memory problems, and so I think he connected with the material straight away and read it and wanted to make the film. It just all kind of came together. So it was very, very. I mean, I've since heard lots of stories about, you know, films being made from books and it being a very tortuous, long-winded process with lots of disappointments. But this wasn't really. It all kind of fell into place very, very easily. And I think Nicole Kidman came on board, I think first, maybe Mark Strong was first. I can't quite remember, but yeah, it was offered to Nicole. She read it, loved it. I think she'd already read the book, wanted to do the film, and then Colin Firth. So it was kind of one of those dream scenarios where you imagine just everything just lined up and seemed to happen, and everybody was free and schedules, and it just all kind of seemed to happen. So it was very easy. So yeah, it was great.
And I'm happy that they didn't change a lot the book.
Yeah, I mean, I took the decision very early on that, well, as soon as I realised that the film was likely to happen, actually, that it was very much Rowan's project and Rowan and Liza's project. And I think of those, I think I've seen some great films that have been adapted from books, and I've seen some terrible adaptations. And it seems to me that one of the things is that when an adaptation tries to be too faithful to the source material, I think it can go badly wrong because it's a different genre. It's a different way of telling the story. So, I mean, the biggest change with Before I Go to Sleep is that in the book, the character Christine is keeping a written diary, and in the film, she's keeping a video diary. But to me, that made absolute sense because, you know, obviously in a book, you're reading it. So you want to read the diary that she's writing. But in a film, to try and do that as a written diary, it would have just been endless voiceovers of, you know, shots of Nicole Kidman huddled over a notepad writing in it whilst, you know, a voiceover happened. And
read from it.
Yeah, it would have just been quite boring and quite, yeah. And so I think what Rowan, the idea that Rowan had of having a video diary made absolute sense because it meant that, you know, well, for obvious reasons. So that was the biggest change. And to me, it's like, I mean, I'm not a musician, but I imagine it's like if you write a song and then a different band or a different artist covers it and brings their own you know, style to it, changes the things that they want to change, that they need to change. I think as long as the melody is and the lyrics and the heart of the song is there in place, it's exciting to hear what someone else can do with it, you know. And I think it's the same it was the same for me with the film of the book. As long as they stay true to the heart of the book and the heart of the story, it was exciting to see what these incredibly creative people could do with it, and that was it was a wonderful experience. So I had no complaints at all about things they changed.
And in the end, I am very curious about your future project or projects. Can you tell us what is it about?
No, I don't like to talk specifically about what the story is. The book I'm finishing up at the moment, which hopefully will be out next year, so that's 2022, is another psychological thriller. That's probably what I'm going to say about it. I don't like talking about things in too much detail because it feels like at the moment it's completely mine. I mean, my agent has now read it and my editor has now read it, so it feels like it's slightly less mine. But I quite like the fact that it's still something that I'm keeping to myself. I think, especially with Second Life, I made the mistake of talking too much too soon about what the book was actually about, and it did change my relationship to the work, and so I made the decision now to kind of keep it to myself. But it is another psychological thriller, and it's also going to be narrated by a woman again. So yeah, that's what I will tell you.
And you know it exists. It exists.
It does exist, yeah.
Your new project.
Yeah, I have a window open on my computer right now. I'm looking at it, so it does exist, yeah.
Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to have the chat with you.
Thank you. It's been really fun.
I loved your books as well.
Thank you.